You broke-ass loser, shut up and get lost. I can't believe I ever trusted you.
Get out of my sight!
Cairo James was 34 years old, a Memphis paramedic who believed, with everything in him, that love was something you showed up for, not something you simply said. He had believed that for 17 years. Then, one Tuesday evening in Buckhead, Atlanta, my wife looked him dead in the eyes and told him he wasn't on her level anymore. And here's the part that will stay with you. Cairo never saw it coming, not because he was blind, but because he had been too busy loving her to notice she had already stopped. What Sydney didn't know was that Cairo had already seen the lawyer's email 3 weeks before she ever said a word. He had already begun making quiet decisions of his own. The Buckhead apartment sat on the 14th floor of a glass tower on Peachtree Road. On a clear night, you could see the city lights spread out like something God had spilled across a dark table. Cairo used to love that view. He was at the kitchen sink on a Wednesday evening in late October, finishing the last of the dishes, when the front door opened behind him. King, their big amber-coated dog, lifted his head from the rug. His tail wagged once, then stopped, as if even he could feel that the temperature in the room had dropped several degrees. Sydney came in without saying hello. She set her leather Gucci bag on the counter, a bag that cost more than Cairo's first car, and walked straight to the refrigerator. She stood there with the cold air spilling out, not really looking for anything. Cairo dried his hands on a dish towel. "There's roasted chicken on the second shelf. Made it the way you used to like it." Sydney closed the refrigerator. "I'm not hungry." She walked to the bedroom. The door didn't slam, it just clicked shut, quietly, firmly, the way a door closes when someone has already made up their mind and is no longer interested in discussion. Cairo stood in the kitchen for a moment. The city lights still glittered through the window. King padded over and pressed his warm side against Cairo's leg. "Yeah," Cairo whispered down to him. "I know." He had known Sydney since he was 17 years old, back in Memphis, Tennessee, on Chelsea Avenue, where the houses were small and the porches leaned a little to one side, and nobody had money, but nobody much talked about it either. Sydney's family lived 2 blocks from his mother's house. Back then, she wore her hair in a simple puff and bought most of her clothes from the Goodwill on Summer Avenue. She was funny. She was warm. She used to show up at his door with a paper bag of biscuits when she knew he hadn't eaten, and she never once made him feel like a charity case. Cairo's mother died when he was 17, ovarian cancer, fast and unforgiving. And Sydney stayed by his side through every one of those terrible nights. She sat with him on the porch when he couldn't sleep. She held his hand at the graveside service when he had no other family close enough to come. They married at 24 in a small ceremony at New Sardis Baptist Church in Memphis. 40 guests, a sheet cake from a bakery on Poplar Avenue, and Sydney laughing so hard during the reception that she had to hold on to the table after spilling punch on her dress. That was the woman he married, my wife. He followed her to Atlanta 2 years later when the executive job offer came in and her salary jumped to nearly 4 times what she had been making. Cairo left his position with the Memphis Fire Department without a single argument. He packed their things, loaded King into the truck, and drove 6 hours south without a complaint. Because that is what you do when you love someone. In Atlanta, he kept the apartment. He cooked. He walked King every morning on the Beltline Trail. He picked up part-time paramedic shift work when he could find it, and he never once made Sydney feel guilty for outpacing him financially. He sent her a text every single night. "Did you make it home?" Even on nights she came home at 2 in the morning, smelling like a party he hadn't been invited to. He never stopped sending it. He just stopped getting answers. One evening, about 7 months before that Tuesday conversation changed everything, Cairo was on the sofa when Sydney walked past him, phone in hand. She paused mid-step, her thumb moved quickly. She locked the screen and smiled at him, Just spam, babe. He nodded, but he had caught a glimpse, just a flash, of a contact name beginning with the letter A, followed by a period. The kind of abbreviation people use when they don't want a name to be obvious at a glance. He said nothing. He went back to the television. But something small and quiet had shifted inside him, the way a floorboard shifts beneath your weight. You don't fall through, but you feel it give. He began paying closer attention after that night. Around that same time, he noticed something else, small, easy to miss. He had come home late from a shift one evening to find Sydney sitting on the bathroom floor with the lights off. She'd told him she had a headache. He'd made her chamomile tea and sat outside the door until she said she was fine. He hadn't thought about that evening again, not until much later when certain other things became clear. Psychologists call this status-driven value shift, when rapid success changes a person's internal measuring stick. The people who once felt like everything begin to register as not enough. Sydney didn't consciously decide to stop loving Cairo. The ruler simply moved. And no amount of dinners or midnight texts was going to change that, because Cairo was being measured by a scale he didn't know existed. That small shift, that one moment of noticing, was the beginning of everything. And what Cairo was about to discover over the next several months would change him in ways he never could have imagined. Cairo gave up his career, his city, his entire life, and followed this woman to Atlanta without a single complaint. Was that real love, or was that his first mistake? 2 or 3 words in the comments. That's love. Big mistake. Both. I want to see where you land. The restaurant was called Bones, and it sat on Piedmont Road in Buckhead, like it had always been there and always would be. The kind of place where the tablecloths were ironed, the parking valets wore actual ties, and everyone at the bar seemed to know each other from somewhere expensive. Sydney had made the reservation herself. She told Cairo it was a work dinner, semi-formal. She said it like a warning. Cairo wore his best blazer. He pressed it himself that afternoon, sitting on the edge of the bed while King watched from the doorway, head tilted, patient, the way dogs watch people they love when something doesn't feel right. He was trying. He was always trying. They arrived at Bones on a Friday evening in January. The Georgia air was cold and damp, the kind that settles into a jacket collar and stays. The entrance glowed warm amber from the inside. Sydney stepped out of the car in a black dress Cairo had never seen before, heels clicking against the pavement, chin lifted at the angle she had developed over the past year. The angle that said, "I belong here," in a way that somehow also said, "And you might not." She was already moving toward the entrance when Cairo locked the car and followed. That was when she turned. "Why would you park right in front?" Her voice was low, but not quiet enough. 2 couples near the entrance glanced over. "You're embarrassing me." There was an open spot. "Move it further back, please." She said please the way people say it when they don't mean please at all. Cairo walked back to the car. He moved it 3 blocks down, walked back through the cold alone, and took his seat beside her without a word about it. Throughout dinner, Sydney introduced him to her colleagues as a friend of mine from Memphis. Not her husband, not Cairo. A friend from Memphis. The way you'd describe someone you once knew and aren't quite sure what to do with now. Cairo sat with his hands folded in his lap, smiled when it was appropriate, and ate his steak. He said very little. On the drive home, he stopped at a red light on Peachtree Road. A single tear slipped down his cheek without his permission. He wiped it away quickly, almost irritated at himself for it, and whispered to the windshield, "She's just under pressure. It's a hard season." When he got home, he went straight to the kitchen and cooked the roasted chicken she used to love. Rosemary and garlic, the recipe he'd memorized because she'd asked for it so often back in Memphis. He placed it in the refrigerator with a note tucked against the lid. Eat when you get home. I love you. She came home at midnight. She ate a granola bar and went to bed. Refusing to introduce your spouse in public is not carelessness. Researchers call it social distancing from a low-status association. It always happens in public first, before a single word is spoken at home. Cairo moving that car alone through the cold wasn't a small humiliation. It was a signal that Sydney had already begun separating her identity from his. And Cairo, like so many devoted partners, explained it away, because accepting what the signal meant was simply too painful to do all at once. 2 days after Bones, Cairo was putting Sydney's dry cleaning away when a receipt slipped from the pocket of one of her blazers and drifted to the floor. He picked it up. A dinner reservation confirmation. 2 people. A restaurant called the Asbury in Charlotte, North Carolina. The date matched the exact weekend Sydney had told him she was traveling to Charlotte alone for a work conference. The receipt read, Sydney and guest. He read it twice. He folded it carefully, walked to the kitchen, and placed it in the second drawer by the stove, the one where they kept takeout menus and old coupons. He closed the drawer without a sound. He didn't say a word about it that evening, or the next day, or the day after. But he had reclassified the situation in his mind. He was no longer paying the warm, hopeful attention of a husband who trusts. He was paying the careful, measured attention of a man who already half knows the answer and isn't quite ready for the weight of it. When Sydney returned from Charlotte, something about her was different. Not her perfume exactly, something underneath it. The trace of someone else's space. Cairo noticed it the moment she came through the door. He noticed how she went straight to the bathroom without kissing him hello. How she laughed a little too easily at nothing in particular that evening, the way people laugh when they are relieved to be back on familiar ground. That night, Cairo lay awake in the dark with one hand resting on King's back, staring at the ceiling. "It's still you and me, right, boy?" he whispered. King exhaled slowly and shifted closer. Cairo did not sleep until nearly 4 in the morning. His phone buzzed on the nightstand later that same week. A missed call from Zora. He looked at the screen for a moment. His sister had been calling more than usual lately. Twice the week before, once the week before that. Each time, he had told himself he'd call back when he had something solid to say. When it wasn't just a feeling. He set the phone face down and stared at the ceiling a little longer. A few weeks after Charlotte, he was scrolling through Facebook, something he almost never did, when a story appeared. Set to a limited audience, visible only to close friends. For reasons he didn't fully understand, Cairo was still inside that circle. It was Sydney. She was smiling, a wide, open, full-face smile he hadn't seen from her in nearly a year. She was standing beside a tall man at what looked like a rooftop bar. His hand was resting at the small of her back. Neither of them was looking at the camera. They were looking at each other. By the time Cairo set his phone down and picked it back up, the story was gone. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. The refrigerator hummed. King snored softly in the corner. Outside, a siren moved down Peachtree Road in the distance, urgent and fading, leaving behind a silence that felt somehow louder than the sound had been. Cairo knew that sound. He had spent his entire adult life running toward it. He knew what it meant when something needed saving. He also understood, sitting at that table in the dark, that some things had already moved past the point where saving was possible. He just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance in love. When evidence contradicts a belief you've built your life around, the mind finds alternative explanations rather than accept the pain of what's true. She's under pressure. Maybe I'm reading it wrong. But every time a person rationalizes away what they can clearly see, they quietly teach themselves that their own perception can't be trusted. Cairo wasn't just losing his marriage in those slow months. He was losing confidence in his own eyes. The truth kept arriving, whether Cairo was ready for it or not. And what arrived next, sitting in plain sight on a laptop screen left open while rain fell against the windows, was the thing that finally shattered the last quiet hope he had been faithfully protecting. Don't go anywhere. The moment that changed everything is coming right now. It was a Thursday evening in early March, and the rain had been falling on Peachtree Road since mid-afternoon. The slow, soaking kind that makes Atlanta feel quieter and smaller than it actually is, like the city has drawn its curtains and decided not to be found. Sydney had left her laptop open on the dining table when she went to shower. Cairo walked past it without thinking, then stopped. He wasn't snooping. He wasn't searching for anything. He stopped because the screen was bright, and the subject line sitting at the center of it was impossible to miss. Divorce consultation. Sydney. The email was from a law firm on Peachtree Street, dated 3 weeks earlier. He read it once, then again. Then he stepped back from the table as though the laptop had burned him. He stood in the middle of the dining room, rain tapping the windows, King asleep in the hallway. The apartment quiet in a way it had never felt quiet before, and understood with the slow and terrible clarity of a man who had been trying very hard not to understand, that my wife had already met with a lawyer. That she had done it quietly 3 weeks ago, while he was making her dinners and texting her goodnight and folding her blazers back into the closet. She had been preparing to leave him long before she had said a single word about it. He closed his eyes. He breathed. He walked to the kitchen and started washing a pot that was already clean. Therapists who work in betrayal recovery call this double life syndrome. One partner already emotionally and legally exiting the marriage, while the other remains fully inside it. The damage isn't just grief, it's retroactive disorientation. Cairo would have to look back on every dinner, every good night, every quiet evening and ask, was any of it real? That specific confusion is caused not by the leaving, but by the lying while leaving. Sydney came out of the bathroom 20 minutes later, hair wrapped in a towel, and found Cairo on the sofa, King beside him, television on but muted. She stood in the doorway. Something in her expression flickered, the way a person looks when they sense they may have been caught, without yet knowing what was seen. She sat across from him. The silence had weight now. Finally, she straightened and spoke in the calm, rehearsed tone of someone who has been preparing this moment for longer than the other person knows. Cairo, we need to talk. He looked at her and waited. You and I should get divorced. I've realized you're not on the same level as me anymore. I can't keep carrying you with me forever. I deserve a man whose value matches mine. The rain kept falling outside. King shifted against Cairo's ribs. Cairo leaned forward slowly, elbows on his knees, and stared at the floor between his feet. He looked up at the wedding photo on the wall, the two of them laughing in the parking lot of New Sardis Baptist Church, Sydney holding her punch-stained dress, both of them young and unaware of anything that would come after. But you promised, he said. His voice barely cleared a whisper. You promised you would love me forever. Sydney looked at the wall, not at him, at the wall. People change, Cairo. I deserve a man whose value matches mine. Psychologists call this transactional relationship framing, treating marriage as a business arrangement rather than a covenant. By that measure, Cairo was underperforming. But what money had blinded Sydney to was simple. Value in a marriage isn't measured in salary. It's measured in presence, faithfulness, and the willingness to stay when staying is hard. By that measure, Cairo had been the higher value partner for years. You just can't explain that to someone who has already changed their ruler. 2 weeks before that conversation on the sofa, Cairo had worked a 24-hour shift picking up coverage at a station on Northside Drive. Midway through the night, a call came in. Pediatric cardiac arrest. 7 years old. A little boy named Marcus, who had collapsed in his bedroom on Collier Road. Cairo and his partner arrived in 4 minutes. He worked on that child for 11 minutes, counting compressions, refusing to accept what the monitor was telling him, until Marcus's heart started again. He rode with the boy to Children's Healthcare of Atlanta on North Druid Hills Road. He watched the doors close between them. Then he sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before he trusted himself to drive back. He never told Sydney. He came home the next morning, bone-tired, sat on the kitchen floor, and held King while he cried quietly, the way a man cries when he has held too much for too long, and has finally found somewhere private enough to put it down. He didn't tell her because she hadn't asked about his shifts in months. Now, hearing you're not on the same level as me anymore, Cairo felt the weight of every single one of those silences land on him at once. He stood up from the sofa, slowly. When he reached his full height, something in the way he held himself had changed. Not anger, but a deep and settled stillness. The kind a man finds when he has finally stopped pretending. "When did you decide?" he asked quietly. Sydney straightened. "It doesn't matter when. It matters to me." She looked away. He nodded, as if that were answer enough. He walked to the bedroom and sat in the dark. 2 weeks passed. They moved through the apartment like strangers in a museum. Careful, deliberate, not touching anything that wasn't theirs to touch. Sydney worked late every night. Cairo cooked for one, and left a covered plate in the refrigerator out of a habit so old it had stopped meaning anything. King watched them both from the hallway rug, going quiet in the way dogs go quiet when they have understood something their people are still pretending not to. It was on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after the rain, that Cairo finally spoke the words out loud. "I'm going to take King and go back to Memphis." He said it simply, the way you say a thing you have been carrying for a long time and have finally decided to set down. But if you think Sydney simply accepted that and let him walk out the door, you would be wrong. Because what she did next, standing right there in their living room while Cairo was still packing, is the kind of thing that will stop you completely cold. Climax 2 is next, and it changes the shape of everything. The Saturday morning Cairo said those words, Sydney was standing in the kitchen doorway with a coffee mug in her hand. She looked at him for a moment. Then she put the mug down on the counter and picked up her phone. She stood in the middle of their living room, the apartment he had kept clean and warm and running smoothly for 2 years, and called her lawyer while he was still standing right there. She did not step into another room. She did not lower her voice. She stood 6 feet away from her husband and spoke into the phone with the steady composure of someone who had been preparing this call for a long time. "Yes, hello. This is Sydney James. I need to move forward with the asset filing." A pause. "I want equitable distribution of all marital assets, savings, retirement contributions, any property interests accumulated during the marriage. Everything on the table." Another pause. "And I want to discuss temporary spousal support. I'll send the documentation by end of week." She ended the call and turned to face him. Her expression held something that was almost, not quite, apologetic. "I have to protect what I built, Cairo. I hope you understand." Cairo looked at her for a long, steady moment. "You're going to claim the savings," he said. Not a question. Just the words, placed in the air without heat behind them. "I earned what we have. That deserves to be recognized." He nodded once, slowly. "Okay," he said. Just that word, just okay. Making that call in plain sight wasn't a legal move. It was what psychologists call strategic humiliation, a deliberate signal that the power balance has fully shifted. Sydney expected tears, anger, or pleading. She got one word. And okay. Calm, unhurried, final, unsettled her more than any argument could have. The person who refuses to perform distress on cue quietly reclaims the high ground. She just didn't know it yet. He was loading boxes into the front hallway when he heard Sydney's voice drift through the bedroom door. Low and careful, the way people talk around a subject rather than through it. He couldn't make out full sentences, but a company name reached him, a name he had never heard before. Meridian Transfer Group. He set down the box he was holding. He waited until the call ended, then walked to the doorway. "What's Meridian Transfer Group?" Sydney looked up. A beat of silence, exactly 1 second too long. "It's a financial services vendor I use for work. Nothing that concerns you." She picked up her phone and began scrolling without looking at the screen. Cairo went back to packing. But he placed that name in the same quiet interior drawer where he'd been filing things for months. The Charlotte receipt, the disappearing Facebook story, the contact saved as A. All of it patient and still, waiting to form a picture. Later, in Memphis, when he finally had the silence to think clearly, the picture would arrange itself. She had been moving money, carefully, in amounts below the threshold of obvious attention, into an account that had no connection to their joint finances. She had been building a financial landing pad long before she ever said the word divorce out loud. Cairo had no hidden accounts, no contingency plans, no parallel preparations. He had simply trusted her. That was the whole of it. He finished packing on a Sunday afternoon. 3 duffel bags, 2 boxes of books, a laundry basket of kitchen things she had never used. King's bed, his bowls, his leash, and King himself, stationed at the front door, with his tail low and his dark eyes watching Cairo's face with the intelligence dogs have about the things their people are trying not to feel. Cairo made one last walk through the apartment. He stood in the bedroom doorway. The bed was made. He had made it that morning out of pure habit. The way you keep doing a thing so long, your hands do it before your mind catches up and reminds you there's no longer a reason. The curtains were open. The Buckhead skyline filled the window. Still beautiful. Still indifferent. He turned off the light. He picked up his bags and carried them to the car. For a while, on the entrance ramp to I-75, he let himself believe it. At least it's done. At least I can breathe. He drove north through Georgia with the radio off, King in the back seat, the city sliding away behind him in the mirror. He was crossing the Tennessee River in Chattanooga, the water gray and wide beneath the bridge, the mountains dark on both sides, when his phone rang through the car speakers. Zora. He answered. "Hey." Her voice was careful, the particular carefulness she used when she was choosing every word. "Are you driving?" "Yeah." "Okay. I need to tell you something, and I need you to not crash the car." He adjusted his hands on the wheel. 5 months ago, Zora said, I was at a company event in Memphis. Sydney was there. She was with a man, tall, well-dressed. They were not behaving like professional colleagues. I told myself I was going to say something to you. Then a week went by, then another. I convinced myself maybe you already knew somehow. And then I just... Her voice broke. "Cairo, I'm so sorry. I should have called you the next morning." Cairo said nothing for a long moment. The road ahead was straight and dark, Tennessee on both sides. His hand tightened around the steering wheel. "It's okay, Z," he said. "It is not. It's okay." Quieter now. "I mean it." He hung up and drove the remaining 2 hours to Memphis in silence. He thought about how many people had known pieces of the truth while he was still in the dark. He thought about what it meant, that a man could be faithful, be present, be fully inside his own marriage, and still be the last to know what was happening inside it. He didn't let himself collapse over it. He had learned, somewhere in the past weeks, how to feel a hard thing without letting it take the wheel. He kept his eyes on the road and kept driving. Researchers who study betrayal recovery call this the conspiracy of silence. People who witness one partner being deceived often go quiet, not out of approval, but because they're caught between protecting someone they love and being the one who delivers the blow. Everyone convinces themselves the betrayed person already knows. Everyone waits for someone else to speak first. What Zora revealed wasn't just what she'd seen. It was that Cairo had been the last person in the room to know the truth about his own life. When someone changes because of money and status, you cannot hold them with the love they used to understand. You can only choose to hold on to yourself. Cairo was finally doing exactly that. But Sydney had one more conversation left in her, and what she accidentally said in that Memphis coffee shop would leave nothing hidden between them ever again. The final meeting is next, and it changes everything. Sydney called 3 days after Cairo arrived back in Memphis and asked to meet. He agreed, and he knew exactly why, not for the reasons people might assume, not to argue, not to be persuaded back into anything. Cairo agreed because he needed to do one specific thing. Look at her face, in daylight, in a neutral place, and confirm that what he had understood about her over these past months was real, not imagined, not distorted by grief. He needed to close the door himself, with his own hand, on his own terms. That was the only reason he went. They met at Otherland's coffee shop on Cooper Street, in the Midtown neighborhood where Cairo had grown up. He arrived 10 minutes early. He ordered a black coffee. He took a booth near the window and sat watching the street outside. Old oaks dropping their last leaves in the October light. A man walking a small white dog along the sidewalk. The ordinary Tuesday morning life of a city that did not know or care that something significant was about to end inside this particular booth. He wrapped both hands around the warm mug. He noticed that his hands were not shaking. He was quietly, deeply glad for that. Sydney came in 7 minutes late. She had dressed carefully, the expensive coat, the heeled boots, the practiced composure she wore the way other women wear a favorite scarf, automatically, because it had become part of how she moved through the world. But as she crossed the room toward him, Cairo noticed something had shifted in the architecture of her confidence. She was holding herself very deliberately, the careful posture of someone working slightly harder than usual to appear untroubled. She sat across from him. She ordered an herbal tea she never touched. They spoke around the edges for a few minutes. Timelines, lawyers, logistics. She handled it all with efficient detachment, as though they were closing out a shared business venture, rather than the decade they had built together. Then she set her hands flat on the table. I couldn't keep dragging you along forever, Cairo. Surely you understand that. He looked at her without blinking. He did not argue. He did not agree. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he loved for a very long time, and has only now, in this coffee shop, on this Tuesday, with this October light coming through the window, fully learned to see without the blur of hope in the way. Amir said you would never understand me. The words were out before her mind caught them. Sydney went completely still. Her teacup, halfway to her lips, stopped in midair. Her eyes widened, just slightly, then dropped to the table with the specific, unmistakable expression of someone who has just handed over something they had no intention of giving. The name settled into the warm, coffee-scented air between them like something with weight. Amir. Psychologists who study emotional affairs call this triangulation, allowing a third person to define your partner for you. Amir didn't just become Sydney's affair partner. He became her mirror, narrating Cairo's limitations back to her until leaving felt not like betrayal, but like self-preservation. Cairo didn't become less valuable.
He was framed as less valuable by two people who needed that story to be true.
Cairo sat with the name for a long, quiet moment. He looked at his wife, at the hands folded carefully on the table, at the small gold earrings he had given her for her 32nd birthday, at the untouched tea, at the composed expression with its fine, new crack running straight through the center of it. There was no rage in him. He searched for it and found only something quieter and far more solid, something that had been building slowly, without announcement, over these past months. Something that felt, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, like the very early edge of peace. "You chose your path," he said. His voice was even, almost gentle. "Now I'm choosing mine." He picked up his coffee. He finished the last sip. He set the cup down carefully and slid out of the booth. Sydney did not speak. She watched him stand, button his jacket, straighten his collar, and something moved across her face that was difficult to name. Not grief exactly, but the expression of a person who has won something and is only now beginning to calculate the full cost of winning it. Cairo did not look back. He returned to the Buckhead apartment 2 weeks later to collect a forgotten box and leave the key. Sydney wasn't home. He moved through the rooms slowly, the kitchen, the bookshelves, the living room with its 14th floor view, still glittering, still beautiful, belonging to no one now. In the bedroom, he found it. Sydney's old gray hoodie folded on the edge of the bed. The one she'd worn constantly back in Memphis, thin at the elbows from washing, soft from a decade of use. She had stopped wearing it sometime in the past year. Around the same time, she stopped answering his good nights. Cairo picked it up. He held it for a moment. His throat tightened with something that wasn't quite grief, closer to the ache of remembering a version of someone who no longer exists. The proof that she had once been different. That they had once been different. He placed it back on the bed. "You don't wear this anymore," he said quietly to the empty room. He picked up his box. He walked to the front door. He left the key on the counter. He did not look back. Grief researchers call this object release, separating your emotional identity from the things that once anchored you to someone you loved. Cairo could have taken that hoodie. Part of him wanted to. He didn't. He named what was true and left it behind. That small act was him telling himself, "I am not going to carry what is no longer mine." 8 months later, in Memphis, something was quietly waiting for Cairo. Something he hadn't known to hope for. And one phone call was about to change the entire shape of what came next. Stay with us. The payoff is here, and it is worth every second you've waited. 8 months is not a long time. It is also, sometimes, a lifetime. In Memphis, Cairo James slowly became himself again. He went back to his unit with the Memphis Fire Department, working out of a station on Union Avenue. His co-workers welcomed him with firm handshakes and a cleared locker, and the unspoken agreement that whatever had happened down in Atlanta was his business and his alone. He rented a small apartment near Overton Park, creaky hardwood floors, windows that rattled when the wind came off the river, a back porch just wide enough for a folding chair, a lamp, and a dog. King spent most evenings out there, watching the neighborhood settle into dusk with the dignified patience of an elder who has lived through enough to know that most things eventually find their level. Cairo was not yet happy. Not in the full, settled way he was working toward. But he was quieter inside than he had been in years. He was sleeping through the night. He was cooking for himself again, which turned out to be a genuinely different kind of pleasure than cooking for someone who didn't notice. Simpler, unhurried, his own. Trauma recovery researchers call this post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon in which surviving a significant loss sometimes creates space for a truer, more grounded version of yourself to emerge. Not because the pain wasn't real, but because the slow dismantling of a life that had been quietly diminishing you can finally make room for what was crowded out. Cairo cooking for himself, sleeping through the night, walking king without checking his phone. These weren't small things. They were a person reclaiming their own interior life. He met Nia through work. She was a nurse at Methodist Lebanon Healthcare on Jefferson Avenue, and their paths crossed often enough across shared emergency cases that not knowing each other would eventually have become unusual. She was direct and warm in equal measure. She said what she meant without staging it. She asked about his day and actually waited for the answer, leaning forward slightly, genuinely present in a way that felt, to Cairo, startlingly unfamiliar. They were not a love story yet. They were something earlier and more fragile. Two people whose company felt honest and unhurried, who took long walks along the riverfront on Saturday mornings and sometimes went stretches without talking because the silence between them was comfortable rather than loaded. Cairo told her about Sydney eventually. Not everything. Enough. Nia listened without filling the quiet with advice. When he finished, she said only, "You sound like someone who loved a person who stopped deserving it. That's a hard thing to carry for as long as you did." He looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "It was." On a Thursday in late June, Cairo was at his kitchen table with a lease agreement spread out in front of him. A small house in the Binghamton neighborhood. A yard for King. A real kitchen. A front porch he had already been imagining. A good chair, a lamp, a Saturday morning with nowhere to be. Nia sat across from him, coffee in hand, unhurried. His phone lit up on the table. "Sydney," he told Nia. She looked at him without pressure. "You don't have to answer." "I know," he said. He answered anyway, because he was no longer afraid of her voice, and that in itself felt like something worth knowing for certain. Sydney's voice was stripped of everything he had come to associate with her over the past year. The corporate precision, the studied distance, the practiced upper hand. She sounded simply like a person who had been awake for too many nights and had stopped pretending otherwise. Her division had been restructured. Her position, the one that had made her feel untouchable, had been eliminated. And Amir was gone. He was married, as it turned out he had always been, and when he discovered Sydney was pregnant, he returned to his wife without a backward glance. "Cairo," she said, and her voice broke on the two syllables of his name. "I don't know what to do. I don't have anyone." She was crying, fully, without performance. And then, mid-sentence, she said something she had clearly not planned to say. "The doctor told me I have to be careful, because of last time, because of what happened before." Cairo went completely still. Last time? What happened before? He didn't ask her to explain. He didn't need to. Something in the specific weight of those words landed in him with the force of a thing that has been true for a long time, and has simply been waiting for the right moment to be known. There had been a pregnancy before this one, during their marriage, a loss Sydney had carried alone, or not entirely alone, and that she had never once brought to him. He thought of a night 2 or 3 years ago when he had come home from a long shift and found her sitting on the bathroom floor with the lights off. She'd told him she had a headache. He had made her chamomile tea and sat outside the door until she said she was fine. He understood now what that night had actually been. He sat with it. He let it settle. He did not speak before it had finished landing. Therapists call this consequence-activated grief. The moment a person's emotional defenses collapse under the accumulated weight of what their choices have actually cost them. Sydney's pain is real. But real regret doesn't generate an obligation. The fact that someone is now suffering the consequences of how they treated you does not mean you owe them your return or your comfort. Cairo understood this, not coldly, not with satisfaction, with the clear-eyed grace of a man who had already done his grieving. Cairo looked down at King, lying across his shoes with the contentment of an animal who has always known exactly where he belongs. He looked at the lease agreement on the table. He looked at Nia's hand resting quietly beside his, present, unhurried, asking nothing. He picked up the phone. "Sydney," he said. His voice was even. "You told me once that I wasn't on your level anymore. I've spent the past 8 months finding my own level. And it turns out I didn't need your permission to do it." A pause. "I hope you find your way through this. I genuinely wish you peace." He ended the call. He picked up the pen. He signed the lease. A tear dropped onto the paper before he could stop it. He didn't wipe it away. He just looked at his signature, Cairo James, clean and unhurried, written on a page that meant, "This is mine. I am beginning again." He reached down and stroked King's head. "At least," he said softly, "someone stayed with me from the very beginning." King's tail moved once, slow, steady, entirely certain of itself. Outside the kitchen window, Memphis went on about its evening. The river running south the way it always had, the sky going warm and wide over the bluffs. The ordinary summer beauty of a city that had been here before Cairo's heartbreak, and would be here long after. Patient, unhurried, entirely unconcerned with anything except continuing to be itself. This story reminds us of something most of us already know somewhere deep in the chest, but haven't said out loud in a long time. When someone you loved for years slowly stops seeing you, the loneliness doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in small, ordinary moments. The dinner table set for 2, but only 1 plate actually used. The side of the bed that stays cold. The grandchildren who call on Sunday, and the 10 minutes after you hang up, when the house goes so quiet you can hear the refrigerator hum from the hallway. That kind of loneliness has weight, and it deserves to be named, not managed, not rushed through. Named. So here is what Cairo's story actually teaches, in the plainest terms possible. Do not wait for someone else to decide your worth. Start small. Tonight, after dinner, take out a piece of paper, not your phone, actual paper, and write down one thing you did today that no one thanked you for. One thing you carried quietly. It doesn't have to be significant. It can be as small as remembering to water the plant by the back door, or folding a blanket that didn't need folding, or picking up the phone to check on someone who hadn't called. Write it down anyway, because the habit of witnessing yourself, of saying, "I was here, I did this, it mattered," is not vanity. It is how a person slowly finds their way back to themselves after a long time of being invisible to someone who should have been paying closer attention. Cairo signed that lease. That was his piece of paper. Yours is waiting. Written by a human with AI as companion, it hopes to leave you with a warm feeling that even when wrongly treated or looked down upon, there are still people and good things quietly standing on your side. Production team, story and screenplay by Quinn Fung, lead screenwriter. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life. Production team, story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.